What's up, Audioholics? Today we are going to be checking out the Yamaha NS-2000A tower speakers. Now the Yamahas are $4,000 each or $8,000 a pair. I will be comparing these speakers to my personal reference speakers, the Perlisten R5ts, which are also exactly the same price. So this is pretty much an even comparison. It's not a versus video, but I do want to have my speakers here as a reference point because the Perlistens do measure really flat and they are a very neutral speaker. Now for the gear that I'm using in this video, I have both speakers hooked up to an amped, that's the name of the brand, amped, preamp and amplifier combo. The amplifier will put out 400 watts per channel, and it is a Class D amplifier. And I'm going to be using an Eversolo DMP6A as my streaming device, and then my source is going to be Qobuz. I've also level matched the speakers. So I threw in a few different songs that I always listen to, my own personal reference songs. First off being Billie Eilish's Bad Guy. As you guys know, it's a very popular song. There is a ton of bass, actually a ton of bass in this whole entire album, but there are some massive bass drops in this song, and comparing the two back to back, switching back and forth, I do think that the Yamahas, well, I found that the Yamahas did have a bigger bass presence for sure. So for this type of music, I'd say pop music, it does have a more heavier bottom end. However, I will say that the Perlistens have a kind of a denser sound, so the way that the bass hits in that song, the bass definitely has more of a tighter presence with the Perlistens, so it punches you a lot harder. Like I could feel it more in the room, I could feel it more in my body. Whereas the bass response on the Yamahas just seemed a little bit more softer. It didn't seem quite as tight and articulate sounding as the Perlistens did. Now another song that I threw in was Full of Life by Christine and the Queens. So at about 1 minute and 30 seconds in, there is a huge bass drop, which I'm sure drops below 20 hertz. So during that particular moment, I did feel that the bass, once again on the Perlistens, delves just a little bit lower to the point where I could feel the reverberation in my room kind of travel up the floor behind my seat. Whereas on the Yamahas, it didn't quite have the same tactile response as the Perlistens, but there was more, the bass kind of bloomed a bit more. Again, just didn't quite have the same smooth, really tight articulation. I think that's probably due just to the enclosure, because I do feel like the Perlisten has a denser enclosure, like it's more inert, whereas the Yamaha, if you give it the knuckle test or if you just pick it up, you can feel it doesn't quite feel as dense as the Perlisten. And I feel that's kind of translating into the bass response, giving it a softer sound. You know, with that being said, I did find that if I was just listening casually to rap music, pop music, that kind of a softer, fuller sound did translate really nicely to being less analytical about what I was listening to. So for like bass response, I felt like maybe it was a little bit more funner sounding, you know, for lack of a better word, maybe more dynamic on the bottom end, just filled the room a bit more over the Perlistens. I also found that with that, you know, tighter response that I got from the Perlistens, that with vocals, particularly the song Clara, I believe it's Wonderwall and Sorry, it's a kind of a medley of both songs. Her vocal presence on the Perlistens is very heavy. It's has a very thick quality to it. So it kind of really projects itself into the room more. Whereas on the Yamahas, it sounds lighter. It's a lighter sound to it. I would say that it almost sounds like Clara is singing more close mic'd for that close proximity effect, whereas on the Yamahas, it almost sounds as if she's maybe about a foot away or so from the mic. So it sounds lighter. There's a little bit more brightness to her voice, whereas on the Perlisten, with not only just Clara's voice, but just male vocals in general, it just seems to be a bit more throatier sounding on the Perlisten. Whether or not that's more accurate or not, I guess that remains to be seen. So I would say the vocal presence on the Perlisten is definitely more forward sounding, whereas the Yamaha, it's lighter sounding. And again, that translates not only from the mids all the way down to the bottom end. Just across the board, I felt like the Perlistens just had a smoother response straight through. And the Yamahas, you know, maybe a beat or two behind on the Perlistens. Now, if we're just talking about like soundstage, detail, the top end, treble response, the Yamaha's 100% is a brighter speaker over the Perlistens. Now remember, the Perlistens do measure really flat. They're a very neutral speaker. So the Yamahas, again, definitely curve upwards over the Perlistens. So on that song by Christine and the Queens, Full of Life, her voice has a very high-pitched quality to it in that song. As the song progresses and her voice kind of gets a bit louder, I found it to be on the edge of being a little bit grating on the Perlisten. So it's like right there from my own personal taste of where I would like somebody's voice to be as far as like just brightness is concerned, without becoming too grating. Whereas on the Yamahas, I felt like it was right there. Maybe just leaned a little bit over the point of where the Perlisten was, where I just found it just a little brighter than I would personally prefer. So even though they were level matched, I could still listen to the Perlistens at that same level, where on this song, I did find myself reaching for the remote a bit quicker, just to turn it down a bit more. I mean, it wasn't causing me pain or anything like that, but I did feel that for me personally, the Yamahas did become more fatiguing over time after listening to these speakers for, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours back to back. Now, one thing about having that brighter, presence on the Yamahas is that the Soundstage is definitely a little bit more detailed. It did have a more airier quality to it. So when I was listening to Sympathy for the Devil from the Rolling Stones, I could clearly hear a delineation between singers, instruments, everything really placed in their own specific sides of the room. Whether it's in the middle room with the phantom imaging or left and right sides, everything just seemed a little bit deeper and a little bit more pronounced, a little bit more air around the instruments. Not that the Perlisten sounded bad, but that neutral presentation of the Perlistens just didn't quite have the same kind of sharp definition around instruments and vocal clarity. So, I mean, if you want a bit more air, more spaciousness to the Soundstage, I'm gonna have to give the Yamaha the edge for this one. I would say that the Yamaha was a few feet beyond the actual physical location of the speakers. So they were maybe about 3 or 4 feet outwards, and maybe about 2 or so 3 feet behind the speakers, whereas the Perlistens maybe slightly behind the speakers, but not as deep as the Yamahas. So, I mean, if you want more of that airy presentation, more of a three-dimensional transparency, I'm gonna say the Yamahas are definitely gonna give that to you. Now, as far as specs, this is a fairly tall speaker measuring 13 inches wide by 44 inches in height by 18 1/8 inches deep, and it weighs 72.3 pounds. This is a 3-way tower with an 1¼ inch tweeter, 3¼ inch mid-range, and 2 6½ inch woofers. It's got a frequency response from 34 Hz up to 65 kHz. Each driver is made from a composite material consisting of Xylon and spruce, which is trickle-down technology from their higher-end NS-2000 speakers. The mid-range and tweeters are mounted on their resonance suppression chambers, which cancel out unwanted resonance generated behind the diaphragm without relying on conventional sound-absorbing materials. They've also used their acoustic absorber resonator tube to eliminate standing waves inside the enclosure. Around back, you'll see that this has a specially designed port to reduce any noise or chuffing. Below the port is a pair of solid brass binding posts that feel very high quality. And the black glossy finish is the exact same as you'd find on Yamaha's grand pianos, so it's got a very luxurious look and feel. Now, Audioholics' main measurement guy has taken a few measurements included here. I believe Gene and James will go into full detail in a future video and also have a written review on the Audioholics website, so be on the lookout for those. Overall, I thought these were very dynamic speakers with a full bottom end that do lean on the brighter side of neutral. I had a great time with these speakers, and I think they're worthy of a listen if you get a chance to check them out. Well guys, thanks for checking out the video. If you want more content, be sure to visit audioholics.com, and for exclusive members-only content, be sure to check out Audioholics on Patreon. Links can be found down below in this video's description. Subscribe if you haven't already, and remember, keep listening.